Okay, you had an overview for us of some of the most painful torture devices of the era?
Most painful torture devices of all time. Now, for many years, Europe was without the luxuries and riches that had marked the height of Rome, because Rome was the big power at the time. And many centuries later, a new interest in learning would mark the beginning of the Renaissance, and we know that as well. The 1,000 years between is called the Middle Ages, or the medieval period. And this period begins and ended with different countries and different times across Europe. It also affected different areas of the continent in different ways. The northern tribes did not stamp out learning completely, only momentarily set it back, and the Catholic Church was already a powerful institution at the end of the Roman Empire, and it continued to be a unifying force between the many small kingdoms. But they wanted to hold power. So one of the earliest ones that was still from the Roman times of torture was the punishing shoes. Now, I don't have a picture here, but you should be able to get that. The punishing shoes were often used in conjunction with the standing pillory, a device that holds your head and wrist in place while you stand. And it was a metal pair of shoes that had spikes in the heel. So you would have to stand on your tiptoes. Now, how long do you think you could stand on your tiptoes before you had to rest your heels on those sharp iron spikes?
Probably no more than 3 or 4 minutes.
And that's the thing.
I'm no ballerina.
Up and down.
Well, don't plan on Nike remaking the punishing shoes anytime soon.
I hope not. Now, this is called the Heretics Fork. Now, it looks simple enough, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The Heretics Fork was a torture device loosely consisting of a length of metal with 2 opposed bi-pronged forks, as well as an attached belt or strap, as you can see right here.
All right.
Now the strap one end of the sharp forks would be pushed underneath your chin, and the other one would go against your chest, just under the sternum. The strap fixing the device to your neck. This effectively immobilized the head at a total extension of the neck, so your head was way up in the air.
Arched back,
and it caused great pain. The 4 sharp points snugly rested underneath the chin and the sternum were designed to allow the victim just enough range of motion with his mouth to murmur a confession, as this shows right here.
That looks less than pleasant. I don't think I would want to wear one of those.
I don't think it was either. It was not really a good fashion design.
I don't like wearing neckties, so that looks generally unpleasant in comparison.
Well, again, you only needed them to be able to murmur their confession, because the whole point of any of these tortures at the time was to get a confession. Whether it was a true confession or not didn't matter.
Were you a heretic? Were you practicing witchcraft? Were you generally fighting against the king? You know.
Were you saying bad things about the royal family? Or the whole thing was, if you confessed, you died a quicker, less painful death. If you did not confess, you died a much more horrible and painful death. Now, a lot of people talk about waterboarding these days.
Yes.
Well, waterboarding is not something new. This is the dunking chair.
Great googly moogly, Dick Cheney.
This was primarily used on women, as was the case of most devices in pseudo-sexual torture, because women were easy to break that way, they felt. The dunking stool would dip its occupant into a river for as long as the authorities saw fit. Dunking is a form of torture and punishment that is applied to scolds and supposed witches. Now, scolds were women who had a tendency to have loose tongues or very sharp tongue and talked bad about their neighbors or the authorities.
Don't spread rumors.
Don't spread rumors. That's right. In a trial by ordeal, supposed witches were immersed into a vat of water or pond, or dumped into a well, and taken out after some time, and given the ability to confess. If she confessed, she was killed. If she did not confess, she was submerged again. This process usually was repeated until the victim drowned or gave up and let herself be executed in another way, hanging or rarely burning. So it was damned if you do and damned if you don't.
Isn't it kind of hard to burn somebody after you've been soaking them in water for hours?
That's why they would usually hang them. Burning wasn't a good thing. They were pretty well waterlogged by that time. Now comes the Spanish boots. The victim's legs were placed between 2 planks of wood and bound together with cords. Between the cords were the torturers placed wedges within which they would violently hammer. Each time a wedge was hammered, the acute portion of the shin bone was shattered, and the tormentors could hammer at least a dozen wedges up and down the legs. When the boots were removed, the bone fragments fell in pieces, and the skin of the lower legs were merely severed as loose sacks for them. Now, this is a much more modern version of the Spanish boot. This is actually a metal boot that both legs slide in here and there are spikes. It looks like here's one is standing up. Instead of putting the wedges, what they would do is crank it closed. Here's another one. Here's the boot wedges, and this would be the form where they would put it, and they would usually heat it up to close it up.
Clamp it in place.
Here is a woodblock drawing of someone being hit with the wedges by this large mallet between those metal spines.
I just want to point out that whoever did this wood carving, that was the most just positive image you wanted to record for posterity. Just, you know, hey everybody, remember that time when this happened?
Well, remember, most people at that time didn't have the ability to read. They didn't have their letters or their ciphers or their numbers. So woodblocks were the way of communicating to the peasantry what would happen. So if the sheriff at the time, let's say, wanted to make sure people were going to behave, he'd say, look what Sir John did to little Mark the Tall. He's now called Mark the Small.
That's a good deterrent, I suppose.
Now we come to a favorite for some people. It's called the pear.
The pear of anguish, right?
Yes. Hinging on your gender, the pear was either placed in your backside or, if you were a female, in your front side. And it's in its thin form and then cranked to open and blossom into a rather uncomfortable position. So it was inserted this way, and it was also an oral one. And it would be cranked and it would open up by the screw system.
Oh,
and
I don't want that open in any body opening whatsoever.
No, because it was like having a blooming onion in your backside. You don't want that.
I'm never going to be able to order that off the menu at Outback Steakhouse again now.
But the one that was the oral one would go in, it would actually unhinge your jaw and break your mandible. For the women, it would actually be opened up enough because you know that area is large enough to hold a child.
Ah, right. That
usually takes time to do that, but it would actually separate and break the hips. And the other side was just mean. Just downright.
Yeah, that's...
Now, I don't have the pictures here, but there is also the water torture. Now, water torture, the Romans used to do this one a lot if they found a guard sleeping, and it was used later on by other people. They would make them drink an entire jug of wine, and then another, till they could not do so anymore. And then they would lay them on the ground and jump on their stomach until the stomach ruptured and they died that way. Usually, to get them to confess, you'd kick them a few times, and when they confessed, then you'd have the big guy jump on them. That was the water torture. Not what we used to think of water torture nowadays.
No, just the drip, drip, drip water method is...
The Chinese water torture dripping on your forehead until you go start raving mad. Now the cat's paw is another one. It looks like a garden rake. And what they would do is they would have you stretched up on a wall or they'd stretch up on a pole, and then they would use this rake and skin you.
Flay you.
It was simply used to slowly tear the flesh from the victim, and oftentimes all the way down to the bone.
Doesn't this also have the name of the Spanish tickler?
It has the name of the Spanish tickler. It was called the cat's claw when it was from Rome, and it went on to become the Spanish tickler.
It was probably the rise of the French tickler that made that delightful nickname go away.
I hope French ticklers do not look the same.
Oh, that's good. I'm pretty sure they don't.
Now the rack we saw earlier.
Yes.
And the rack does exactly what it looks like it does. The rack pulls your body from end to end until your limbs are slowly plucked from their joints. The rack consists of an oblong rectangle, usually wooden frame, slightly raised from the ground, with a collar at one end or both ends, having at one end a fixed bar which the legs are fastened, and the other is a movable bar so that the hands are tied. The victim's feet are fastened on one roller and the wrists are chained to the other, and we make them bigger as we go. Now, here's another one that was very popular, especially it was even used here in the New World by the American Indians. It is called quartering by horses. You tie each of the limbs to a horse and have them go to the 4 points of the compass. You have them there, you ask them to confess. If they wouldn't confess, then you have 4 people smack the back of the horse and send you off on your way. Well, at least send your arms and legs going to the 4 points of compass.
At the bare minimum, that was going to result in dislocation, if not dismemberment.
Most likely dismemberment, especially these are big horses.
Big draft horses.
Yes. Now there's the other one called cleansing the soul. In many Catholic countries, the clergy believed that the corrupted soul of a damned person could be cleansed if they were forced to consume boiling water, burning coals,
That's why McDonald's started putting their warnings on their coffee.
That's right. Or they'd put both, boiling water and burning coals. And of course, this was what happened to prisoners before they were punished for their crime. Sort of a warm-up torture, if you will.
Just that the warm-up.
The warm-up, yes. Now, here again, going back to this pear, I forgot to show you, there's another picture of the pear.
Oh yeah.
Because it was a favorite of a lot of people. They got very ornate in the way they did
Yeah,
these.
that's pretty handle.
Yes. Now we have the hanging cage.
Ah, yes.
Yes. The pictured victim is one of the lucky ones because most occupants were caged completely naked to expose them to the either extreme cold or hot weather conditions. And most caged prisoners were usually placed in there only after other means of extreme physical torture was administered. But wait, there's more. The victim was left in the cage until they died from either the elements or thirst, which could take weeks.
Weeks. I'm pretty sure, is that not when they introduced the character of Mad Mardigan, the one that's played by Val Kilmer in Willow? They find him in one of these cages.
Found him in a cage. His was not a tall stand-up cage, if I remember right. His was one of those where he could only sit. Now they had cages where they could only stand, where they could only lay, where they would be so they were completely uncomfortable. Now they're open cages, and like they said, most of them were naked in there, so they were just used for ridicule on the street. People would come by, traveling on the road, and it was nothing for them to throw things at the people in there to give themselves amusement. It's always better to take your pain and suffering out on those who are immobile.
If I can add, these were
garbage.
Also commonly found at harbors, where they would hang people convicted of piracy to warn other sailors or warn other would-be pirates coming into those waters of what the punishment would be for their crimes.
Come to think of it, it is in the first Pirates of the Caribbean movie when Jack arrives at
it
port,
is.
They have a person that's already died in one. So yeah.
And they weren't always cleaned up, so sometimes you were placed in there with the previous occupant or occupants.
Well, he wasn't using it anymore.
No, they're not. Now we have the head crusher.
Seems like it's got a pretty accurate name.
Yes, the person would lay down, face down, on the table, and this skull cap, usually some of them had jagged edges around them, was placed on the top of their head and then corkscrewed down. So you could actually determine how much pressure you wanted to give them, such as mild headache, migraine, or oh, mother of God, get me out of here.
That's just pretty much a vice, really, isn't it?
It is.
Huh.
And here's a description here. Death by head crusher usually meant something like this. The teeth imploded into their sockets and smashed the surrounding jaw bones. Then the eyes squirted from the sockets, and finally brain matter squirted from the ears. Unbelievably, many nations still use a version of this head crusher to this very day as an interrogation tool.
Well, I'm glad I don't live in one of those countries, I think, and I hope.
Yeah. Now, there's another one which was burning at the stake. A favorite execution of those accused of witchcraft. Clergy believed that the burning of a witch permanently removed the evil spirits from the physical world, thus eliminating the possibility of any further contamination of innocent souls.
Purification by fire.
Makes sense.
Yes, if you have no concept of logic whatsoever. Well...